Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Can I just ask the attendees to write in the box if you can hear us okay? It's a simple yes or no will be perfect. Awesome. Okay, so today we are going to talk to you about cyber insurance, data protection, and you and your business. We will run the session for about half an hour, 35 minutes of talking. There will then be 10 minutes for you to ask us any questions. So if I can just ask that you make a note of your question and ask us when we draw the webinar to the point where we're ready to ask questions, that'd be super. And then what we will also do is at the end of the webinar, we'll ask you whether or not you are happy for us to arrange a follow-up call with you. If the answer is no, that's absolutely fine, and you'll get a copy of the recording, but we will not do any follow-up. If you are interested in hearing from either Jennifer or myself, please say yes, and then we'll arrange a follow-up call. Okay, so without further ado, let's work through the presentation. So I'm joined today, so my name's Kelly Peters, I'm a co-founder of Databasix. I am joined today by Jennifer Toner from BGI UK. I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
So I'm Jennifer Toner and I work for BGI UK. I've only recently started working there, but what's quite exciting is the way that we're looking to approach cyber insurance. Even in the insurance industry, it's a subject that's a little bit taboo. People don't necessarily want to engage with it. So hopefully today what I can do is demystify it. I'm very grateful to Kelly and Gina for having me here to give me that chance, really. So hopefully I'll be able to let you know how it can help you and what you can do to help yourself, because insurance is only part of a cyber risk management strategy. It's important to note that it's not the be all and end all. You do still need to have a strategy in place to protect yourself.
Okay, so next slide is then, do you want to give a quick overview of BGI?
So BGI are an independent insurance broker that's been trading for over 30 years. We are still independent despite the fact the insurance broking industry has gone down a route of some kind of oligopoly, and we've really taken on cyber as what we want to be able to communicate as one of the most important business risks that is out there. It's not just something that's an add-on like the legal expense. It's something that you need to start your conversation with in your insurance conversations.
So the main bulk of the session will be, what we're going to do is I understand that you can't hear Jennifer as well, so we're just going to talk much louder and talk. So can you hear me? Okay, I might be very loud. Okay, so I'm just going to ask Jennifer to pretty much shout, so hopefully that will be okay. So do let us know if you can't hear. So how well do you know your policy?
So this is what I wanted to start with, is basically just having a look at your commonplace everyday policies. At the end of the day, people don't realise that their insurance isn't there to just pay out on anything. It is essentially a contract. So it's really important to understand what terms you need to comply with. So there's a couple of scenarios I just wanted to go through. So your friend has borrowed a van because they're moving and they actually can't drive, so they need your help. Driving other vehicles is covered on your policy. Do you think that's something that you can help with?
Tell me.
Well, actually, no. It's something that has come up several times. Driving other vehicles actually only applies to driving other cars. So it's not even necessarily a matter of permission. It is really that you can only drive other cars, not vans. So my second scenario is that you're hit from behind at traffic lights. It's a non-fault incident and your no claims discount isn't affected. Will your premium be affected?
Yes.
It very much will. Basically, your discount is just the percentage that is taken off the final premium that's calculated. It has been shown that people who have one accident, even if it isn't their fault, are slightly more likely to have another one. So your premium probably will go up. And another scenario is that you're on the way to a meeting with a new client, it's away from your office, and you just accidentally hit the curb, causes some scratches to your car. Your policy is comprehensive and covers social, domestic, pleasure, and commuting. Are you covered?
Yeah.
Actually, no. So the commuting section only covers you to travel to one place of business. It won't cover you if you have to go to training or you have to meet clients. That's something you will need to get covered under business use on your policy. And then the final thing I just wanted to cover off is averages. So averages are the way historically insurers deal with underinsurance. So if you insure your house for £100,000, but your house is actually worth £200,000, if you have a fire, it burns down to the ground, a surveyor comes out, what will happen is they will reduce your claim by 50% because you have underinsured by 50%. So it's really important to declare values accurately if you actually want to be covered.
Excellent. So that's sufficiently scary. So hopefully, what Jennifer's now going to talk to us is about how we can put this into context from a cyber insurance perspective.
Exactly. So it is just knowing that insurance is a contract. The insurers promise to pay, but at the same time, they expect you to comply with your end of the contract. So in the cyber insurance climate at the moment, it's been rated the #1 UK business risk by Allianz. And at the moment, 52% of small firms and 66% of medium firms are targeted. The perils are specified within the policy, so it's really important to make sure that you don't assume that you're covered for all eventualities. That's actually the same on any insurance policy. Nothing will cover you for everything. And it's important to note that you are expected to comply with the terms set out in the policy wording. So rather than just your schedule, that big horrible booklet you get with every policy, you need to make sure you read it, unfortunately. If you don't, the contract isn't complied with, and the insurer can repudiate a claim. The insurers have remedies if you don't comply with the contract as per the Insurance Act of 2015, and depending on whether you haven't disclosed something recklessly or whether you've done it by accident, because you're a business, there's more of a responsibility on you per that legislation to disclose what needs to be disclosed and to manage your risk as you should.
So it's pretty important then from a cyber insurance perspective that a business doesn't just take out any insurance policy, that they understand what they're taking out and what they need to be able to demonstrate so they don't invalidate the policy.
Exactly. So there's a couple of important things to cover off with regards to the terms. On cyber insurance, phishing can actually be excluded. Some insurers do consider that a sort of fraud, so it would need to be covered under a separate crime policy. Another thing that does come up in my conversations with people is that they say that they have certain parts of a cyber insurance policy covered under another policy, such as professional indemnity or computer breakdown. Now that can be true, but cyber insurance will always be more specific to the cyber risks. It's sort of similar to if you have home insurance, which covers your mobile phone, and then you have travel insurance, which also covers it when you're overseas. They're different policies, they cover different things, but they have this slight overlap. Don't think because there's the overlap that you don't have exposures. It's also important to note that all the perils defined within policy wording, and there can be a difference in sublimits. So, for example, some policies will cover your business interruption, but it might have a limit of 3 months. It's important to consider if that's enough for you or whether you need to actually have more of a conversation. At the moment, with cyber insurance, because it's relatively new, there's actually a real lack of data on the way courts will approach a breach of terms. All the policies say, in general, that you have to act as a reasonable person. And it's yet to be defined exactly what a reasonable person would do in relation to protecting their data and protecting their business. So we shall see, but in keeping with best practice, you need to know what you're going to do yourself as a business to protect yourself, and then look at the insurance as part of that.
So from a business interruption perspective, the businesses that are on the webinar need to understand what are the potential interruptions that they could have that relate to cyber insurance, and establish, do they have sufficient cover for that?
Exactly, because particularly in the cases of breaches, many customers will leave. You will suffer a loss of revenue, and that can actually be taken into account under this type of policy. So just to run through a quick example of a claim, it's a very popular one for almost every industry to use because everybody stops working on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully you guys haven't just yet. So basically an employee sent a malicious email at 5 to 5 on a Friday, and it appears to be from the managing director. So the employee just clicks on a malicious link and it happens to download some key logging software. Key logging software will actually record every single keystroke, and that will include some sensitive client details and, in this case, bank details. So data had been stolen and more than 1,000 credit card details were stolen or compromised. Under this type of policy, data notification costs can be covered. And in this case, local newspapers actually tipped off and asks for a statement before they issue the story in their next edition. And public relations costs would also be covered under this type of policy. And it's really important because you'd be surprised the trouble you can get into just by saying the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I think the example of that was the Talk breach. The chief executive was very keen to get in front of the press very early about the breach that they had, and actually there was quite a significant amount of negative feedback because she hadn't consulted PR firms, hadn't talked to legal teams to properly present the view of what had happened. So it's useful to know what the cover of what has happened in this particular incident.
And then there can be a case of cyber extortion following on from this, because essentially the hacker has the data, they can sell it on the dark web, they can do a lot with it. So they threaten to publish the financial data unless a ransom is paid. This type of policy can cover ransoms if that is the best course of action to protect your data. Malware can actually also damage hardware. So in this case, the hard drive was damaged, and the cost to repair and restore and replace the affected parts of the system can also be covered.
I think what is really quite important here is that typically, from a data protection perspective, breaches will happen later on in the week. There's lots of statistics that support Thursday and Friday afternoons being quite vulnerable. So I think whilst this is an anatomy of a claim, I think what you also need to be sitting alongside this is on a Friday afternoon when this has happened, how does that individual engage with the organization's data protection lead or their data protection officer so that it's not left on a Friday and only picked up again on a Monday. The ICO has recently said that there are a significant number of breaches that takes at least 60 odd days before they're actually notified. Now, if there's a risk to individuals in terms of their rights and freedoms, you have 72 hours. So it's important to note that that Friday afternoon, as much as you know how the claim is going to potentially help you, it is an afterthought. You have to be thinking about how you're addressing this breach as and when it happens, and that you have the appropriate policies and procedures and people in place to start handling that breach.
So just to move on to the components of cyber insurance, from the claim example, you can see that it can be quite all-encompassing, but not every policy will cover all of these. But these are the things you really need to look out for. So data breaches, which is something Kelly is very familiar with, are a very important section of cover. Something that people don't always consider is the forensic investigations. They can be extremely costly to see how the data was breached. Also legal advice and notifying customers. You need to notify your customers within 72 hours. If you have 1,000 compromised records, most smaller businesses would struggle to reach that. So having the support is something that a cyber insurance policy can offer. Also, your cyber business interruption. So it's compensation for loss of income. That can actually be paid out in quite creative ways. It can be paid in ways just to cover, your loss of income while your network's down. It can be paid to you if you lose clients. It can perhaps even be paid to provide discounts off invoices to prevent you losing clients. So it can be quite a flexible cover, and it's worth talking to your insurer about. Hacker damage is also covered. So things like ransomware and denial of service attacks. If you're an online business, obviously denial of service is what's really going to hit you. So it's something really need to consider. Data extortion is also covered. So holding your business to ransom. As I mentioned, insurers will pay the ransom if it's the best course of action, but that's where the forensic investigations come in, because it can be the best course of action, but at the same time, you can pay a ransom for somebody who's got no intention of giving you your data back, so it can be a waste of time. Also on the policy, you've got your notification costs. Like I say, it's extremely costly. I think the statistic we use is it can cost up to £20 per compromised records to notify your clients. You lose 1,000 records, that's a significant cost for any business. Intellectual property can also be covered. So if you're a business that perhaps trades on design work or anything that you've patented, if it's stolen via a hacker attack, that's something that can be picked up under your cyber insurance. And similarly, privacy protection is covered under there. So if there are any sort of defence costs, or you need to pay compensation to your clients for failing to keep their data secure, that can also be picked up under this policy. Penalties levied by regulators can be covered, but it's important to note that fines under the GDPR regulations will not be covered, because it's against public policy. Insurers won't pay if you've been negligent and you have failed to follow the law.
I think that's a really interesting point. I routinely have been asked, if I was to get an insurance policy and I was to be fined by the Information Commissioner, would I be covered by that fine? So the answer is no, you would not be. I think it's important, in particular, that notification piece. From a data protection perspective, you need to know who you're going to be contacting, who's been affected, how quickly you need to be able to respond to that. And in the same instance, how quickly are you responding to the Information Commissioner to let them know that you've had a breach? Because what we're talking about here are likely to be breaches that are personal data that has credit card information that could lead to financial distress, or it is sensitive information that could lead to emotional distress. So they're the types of notifications that you're going to have to engage both your customers, your service users, however you describe those individuals, and the Information Commissioner.
I think it's important also and interesting that emotional distress is something that's now being picked up, because obviously the compensation claims that are paid for emotional distress in isolation are very small. Yeah. But if you end up in a situation where you've got vast groups of people who want to claim together, that's where you're going to have issues. And it's something that some people are thinking might become the next PPI, these emotional distress claims following data breaches. So that's something to be aware of. So just a little bit more about what's at risk. It's your intellectual property and your data. So the Commission on Theft of American Intellectual Property estimates annual losses of between $225 billion and $600 billion. I couldn't find the statistics for the UK, but I think just the scale of that loss is indicative of what can actually happen to businesses when their intellectual property is compromised. And with data breaches, 47% of consumers would consider moving their business due to a data breach. What that means is essentially you could lose half your book of business just from one breach. And that's not a situation I think many businesses could absorb.
No, and I agree. I think it's incredibly important that you understand the long-term implications of a breach on your business. And as much as you could receive a financial penalty, you're more likely to be affected more quickly, because it takes time to investigate and issue an enforcement notice, by the lack of trust that customers have in you. And there are various statistics out there that suggest that up to 50% of customers will walk away, and they will tell others. And I think that's an important fact to remember.
So then just moving on to how it's actually at risk, it's important to understand where your exposures are. So 71% of groups use spear phishing, and that's the most widely used infection vector. So essentially it's the thing that's most widely used. So it's picking out a specific person within a business and targeting them, perhaps the head of accounts, to pay invoices, things like that. It's phishing, but it's just more targeted. Ransomware is also becoming more widespread. Toolkits are priced less than the average ransom, so it's about $420 for a toolkit, and then a ransom, the average ransom is about $530. So you make your money back straight away. But I think it's important to know that it's not just expert hackers that are targeting people these days. Literally any of us could log on to the dark web and buy this and hold a business to ransom.
Not that we are suggesting in any shape or form that you suddenly go out because you're bored with your job and to go out and download this type of software.
I mean, it's quick profit, so I can't advise on that. Then you've got a 54% increase in the last couple of years on mobile malware variants. So it's on your mobile phone, on your mobile devices, your iPads. It's not just your desk computer in your office. And there's also a 46% increase on the ransomware variant. So that's important. So ransomware is generally covered, but the fact that it's changing ever so slightly every single time makes it more difficult to solve the problem for the forensics team, and it just takes a little bit longer. And 43% of organisations have experienced a breach or attack. And those are only the ones that have been reported.
Yeah, I mean, and what I would say is one of the questions we always ask when we're conducting an audit is, what is your greatest risk? So these are the things you should be thinking about. Is it the spear phishing? So is it that your accounts director is likely to be affected because they are the ones that are easy to access? Is it the fact that you've not trained your staff, so there's a greater risk of staff being vulnerable to phishing scams? So from a data protection perspective, think about what are your greatest risks and what can you put in place to mitigate that risk, whether it be appropriate IT, software, hardware, or it's as simple as training and having appropriate policies.
So just on that note, the way that cyber threats are implemented is changing. So I did touch briefly on the fact that mobile devices are key. Only 20% of Android users are using the most up-to-date software. That's a mad statistic. Essentially, the easiest thing you can do to stay secure is make sure you update every single time. I know it's inconvenient, nobody really likes doing it, but it's so vital because it will patch exposures to your mobile device. And we are all using our mobiles to work these days, whether it's our own personal one or one that's been supplied by our work. It's going to become the way that cyber criminals are able to access your network is through your mobile phones. And also people are getting more smart using VPNs. That's a virtual private network, but not all VPNs are created equal. Sometimes you might literally just be connecting to a private network that's for you in your office. But if you've bought a commercially available system, sometimes you can be connecting to a private network of a bunch of people you don't know their intentions, and you don't know what they can access. So it's important to do your due diligence when finding a VPN to use. Another important thing to notice is that so many things these days are connected to your network, the Internet of Things. It's not just your mobile and it's not just your laptop. There's a 600% increase on those sort of attacks, and 91% of those are denial of service. So these are really easy entry points for criminals to intrude upon. So for example, in networked cities, traffic lights have been taken out, and these have real world impact. And it's something that cyber criminals are only going to do more. And on that note, Fiat Chrysler recalled 1.4 million hackable cars in 2015. For a company to go through that level of admin, the risk is serious.
And I would say one of the things that we have found when we have conducted audits, for sure, one of the questions I asked was, how confident are you that every computer on the network has the most latest up-to-date software, regardless of whether you're on an Apple or you're on a Windows PC? Do you have the latest operating system updates? Does your firewall have the latest software patches on it? When was the last time you made sure that your server was appropriately checked for any vulnerabilities? And you'd be surprised how often the response I get is, we haven't checked, we don't have any idea. So Jennifer's point about making sure your software is updated is find a convenient time as quickly as possible to make sure you do implement those software changes.
So it's also important to shift the conversation. So cyber best practice needs to be the starting point rather than something that you only consider because of regulation. So rather than thinking, oh, I need to comply with GDPR, I think the conversation needs to be how best can I protect the data that I have, particularly because it relates to people, and your online personhood is now perhaps even more important than your physical personhood. And we already protect people physically through the Health and Safety at Work Act. Now we need to protect people's data, because to be honest, if somebody broke my arm, I'd probably get over it quicker than if somebody stole my identity. So moving on to also making that sort of threat tangible, what I think is important to have a sort of centralized dashboard of data resources, so people who are in your company can understand what data you hold, and where it is, how it can be accessed, who can access it, because all of that sort of thing is incredibly important. So the board level of any company needs to become actively involved in the cybersecurity process and be aware of cyber as a genuine business risk. It's not something that's coming in the next few years. It's not something you can put off. It's something that's happening now. And you also need to understand the threat of who would be targeting your organization, because it does vary, obviously. There are some businesses where it might be your competitors. There are some businesses where it might be actual cyber criminals. There's a lot of different ways you can be targeted, and it's important to make security hygiene part of business as usual for your employees and for anybody who works there. So things like changing passwords, scanning for vulnerabilities, all of that sort of thing. Ethical hacking and testing of threats is also a way to make it all too real for some people when you can actually see what somebody can find out about your business and they're doing it for you to show you. I think that's something people can engage, it's worth doing. And I think Kelly touched on this earlier, 68% of breaches actually take months to discover, and the damage that can be done in that time is unreal. So just going back, so you understand the actual costs, and this should make it real for some people. This is an actual claim that we saw from Hiscox, and they gave a breakdown of the different aspects of cover that were taken into account in a ransomware claim. So in this one, you can see that the ransom is so small compared with everything else. The ransom's about £5,000, where the real costs came in were the forensic costs, so the IT and cybersecurity. And those are really where you don't want to save money. You want to engage the best people, and you want them to be able to find out what's happened and how it can be prevented in future. And then also the business interruption, which, as I mentioned, is something people don't always think about when they think about their cyber insurance. They think, for example, if their building burned down, they wouldn't be able to trade. Very, very true. But if you can't trade for several weeks because your website's down or because your data's been compromised, that's also a very real effect. And obviously also legal defence costs are quite important, but it's interesting that they're not actually quite as high as the other aspects, because everybody thinks lawyers are the ones who are making money, and it seems to have moved on from that slightly. The business interruption, like I say, it can be very important to mitigate the cost of the claim as well. So in this case, this was where they provided discounts on invoices and things like that um, to actually make sure that they lost as few clients as possible, and then also took into account for the next several months that there were some clients that had left. So the benefits of cyber insurance, you've basically got three different types of policy. You've got your really basic ones. They'll cover your legal liabilities and compensation costs, but they can also cover things like your legal defense. And then you've got package policies, which are very reasonably priced if you're a small to medium business. And they'll extend to cover the different things that we were talking about earlier, so forensic costs, business interruption, and hacker damage. But you have to be careful, because even though they are cheaper, that does mean there can be less cover or increased terms. So really what we would recommend is a bespoke solution, if at all possible, because this is underwritten on a case-by-case basis. So if you have good risk management, that can be taken into account. So it means the insurers provide a more competitive premium. It means if there is a claim, it's a smoother process because they understand what you've already done and the position that they're starting from, which if you go for a package policy isn't always the case. So we would recommend a bespoke solution if you can, because not one size fits all.
And I think the challenge is there's a lot of temptation to get cheap packages out there without necessarily understanding what is being covered and why it's being covered.
So what insurers are looking for when you are going to them for a quote is that you understand the data that you hold. So you need to comply with GDPR and industry regulations, but further than that, you need to know what your risks are. And they also want you to have a knowledge of cybersecurity. So they want you to be able to demonstrate that you've trained your staff and that you update passwords regularly and all those kind of things that go into security hygiene. And they also, some insurers do look at the fact that you might have an accreditation. So something like Cyber Essentials, very easy to get hold of, a government-backed scheme. I would recommend everybody do that if they can. But also an international accreditation, ISO 27001, is something you can look into if you're sort of a bigger business and you want more of a comprehensive look at your cybersecurity. And then they also want you to have a disaster recovery plan so that it demonstrates that you have business resilience planning. You've got contingencies to minimise the loss, because insurers, they pay claims, that's what they do, but they're not looking to pay for something that could have been prevented. You know, if you notice your house burning, you would need to call the fire brigade. If you don't, the insurers might have some questions as to why you didn't. And then another important part is the fact that nobody sort of works in isolation anymore. Everybody's part of a chain. So accountability in the supply chain, wherever you sit in it, is going to become vital, because your clients are going to be the people who come to you. And if, for example, you're a contractor for a larger organization, they will come down on you like a ton of bricks if you haven't taken care of what you need to. So cyber criminals will always target the weakest link in the chain, because cyber criminals are lazy in many ways. They just want the easiest route in. So if that's you, then you're in trouble.
And I would say from a supply chain perspective is that if you are acting as a data processor for an organization, there should be an agreement between yourself and the data controller. If you are the reason that there has been a data breach, you have to notify the controller, because it is the controller's responsibility to report that incident to the information commissioner and their customers. It's not your responsibility as a data processor. So it is absolutely vital that as part of that supply chain, where you are a controller, you make sure that you have the appropriate measures in place from a data protection perspective, whether they be controls, you've checked compliance of your suppliers, so that you understand, is there any weakness in that supply chain? And if so, how can you address that? So it is an important element to consider, both from a cyber insurance perspective and also from a GDPR perspective.
Exactly. I think anybody who's outsourcing any part of their business will end up in a position where they require you to demonstrate what you've actually done, whether it's working with a cybersecurity company, a data protection company, or whether it's showing that you've actually got insurance. It's just so they know who they're working with takes this as seriously as them, and that's going to become more important. So what you should do, very briefly, is review your current procedures if you have them. If you don't, write them. It's really important to check that your staff know how to respond to a breach or attack. They need to know who they need to talk to exactly. It can't be vague, because what will happen is they'll notice that something might be wrong, they'll forget about it, they'll want to hide it, they might be embarrassed. They need to know who to talk to straight away, and they need to know that they're not going to be shamed or embarrassed about it. Talk to peers, talk to people within your industry to see what they do and share best practice. Engage professionals, very important. There's a lot of facilities out there to obtain reports on your weaknesses and look at your data, and there are solutions that will actually suit all budgets, as long as people recognise that it needs to be part of their budget, because it's a real business risk. You will end up losing your livelihood in the event of a claim if you haven't taken into account all of these different aspects. And then also talk to a broker. Cyber insurance, it really shouldn't be treated as an off-the-shelf product. You really need to talk to somebody who's regulated and advised. It might sound strange, but some brokers can't actually give you recommendations or basically do anything other than read you the policy wording. You need somebody to interpret it for you, unless you want to spend your whole life with that horrible booklet that everybody gets.
And I would say from a data protection perspective, make sure if you at a minimum have a data protection policy, have a data privacy policy and notices. Make sure that with your supply chain, as I've just mentioned, that there are appropriate measures in place to manage that work, but really understand what is the data that you're processing as an organization. What is the greatest risk if that data was to be lost, stolen, put up for sale, and then how do you mitigate that whilst thinking about what insurance that you need to have to cover you in the event that this breach happens.
So I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail why it's really important to talk to a broker. Obviously, I would love you to talk to me, but it doesn't have to be me. But brokers can provide an insight into all of the sort of jargon and all of the terms that you're going to see. They'll be able to provide you advice on the best policy. They'll be able to help you to understand your risks. And usually what we'll be able to do is provide a bit more of a holistic solution. So at BGI UK, we are working with companies like Databasix to make sure that we're not just selling a policy that's possibly not going to pick up anything because you haven't done what you need to do in the first instance. We want people to look into their risk management and then come to us to actually help them find the right policy. So I've included a Woody Allen quote on there because I find it funny. Have you ever, there are worse things in life than death. Have you ever spent an evening with an insurance salesman? And that's because everybody finds it so tedious, but it's our job as a broker to help you be engaged with the policy that you're buying, help you understand it, help you feel the real peace of mind that you actually want from a policy. So as I mentioned earlier, BGI has been established since 1982, so we have access to all different types of insurance providers and different types of policies, and we work in a lot of different niche areas, so we're not afraid to work in more unusual business types and different trades. So we look to provide simple solutions to complex risks, and that's really what I want to help do for people.
I'm going to take 30 seconds of your time. I very passionately believe that every organisation should have a data protection culture. So if and when a breach happens, your staff are aware of what's happened, who to talk to, and what are the policies and processes to follow. That there will always be a risk, but you've got appropriate processes in place. If you're not sure how to write policies, we can help you. If you're uncertain as to whether your staff have been trained, we've got facilities that allow us to come in, deliver you training, or deliver you on our web e-learning training. If you want to know more, happy to have that conversation. So we've got 8 minutes of questions. So by all means, this is your chance now in the box. Bear in mind what you've heard Jennifer talk about. Are there any particular questions that you have that you'd like to get an answer for whilst we have Jennifer here? So please do type away. Oh, so the question that we have is, do you have any information on how often policies pay out, Jennifer?
Not at a broad level. The only thing I can say is we've been working with Hiscox recently, who are a large provider, and what they've said is they haven't repudiated any claims yet. Yet is important because it's a new type of policy. Insurers do want a good public view of it, as well they should, and they want to be paying out on claims. But as it progresses and larger claims come through, they might tighten up on it. We don't know what they're going to do. They might put premiums up, or they might become stricter on actual compliance with the terms. So it's best to start from the position that your cyber policies internally are in place, so you know you're as protected as you can be, and then the insurance will pick up anything that just can't be accounted for, because with cyber breaches it is a case of when, not if, unfortunately.
So at the moment, there is payout is happening,
Yeah.
but that may change in the future the more cases
Yeah.
that come through the system and are challenged. Excellent. Are there any other questions from the group that we have? Okay. What I would suggest is if there are no other questions, that my contact details are on the screen, which I'm hoping you can see. I appreciate there has been some problems with the screen, and I apologise for that. If you would like to contact us, my details are on here, and I can make sure that Jennifer's details are made available to you. What I would like to ask now is a very quick question: is of the people that are on this webinar, can you indicate whether or not by a yes or a no you would like us to follow up with you? If you leave it blank, we'll take that as a no. If you do want us to follow up, please say yes, and then we'll absolutely arrange a 15-minute call within the next few days with you.
I just want to say thank you as well. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that I'm strangely passionate about, but not everybody else is. So it's really nice that people are interested and they want to have these conversations because they're so important.
And thank you, Jennifer, for taking the time out of your day to come join me here at the Databasix office. It's been great. We will make these slides available. The recording will be up on our website on Monday afternoon. Everybody that's attended will get an email notification with the link, and then you can watch the webinar as often as you like. And obviously, you can share it with anyone that you feel it will be beneficial to. So I really hope that it has been a useful insight into cyber insurance. I know I've picked up a lot that I wasn't aware of. Hopefully you've got some insight into some of the data protection elements that you need to be considering. I thank you very much for giving us 40 minutes of your time on a Friday lunchtime. Thank you ever so much. Feel free to leave us now. And like I said, you will get a copy of the presentation within the next 72 hours. Thank you ever so much. So the quick question was, yes, you will get a copy of the presentation on Monday.